You really think a man like you belongs in this building?" The lobby of Carter and Vale Holdings erupted in laughter as Evelyn Carter stared at the man before her. Frayed suit, rain-soaked shoes, a stack of rejection letters in his hand. Caleb Hayes did not flinch. He simply met her eyes and said, "Give me 30 days. If I create no value for this company, I will disappear on my own." 29 days later, the board would discover the man they mocked held the one secret that could destroy the entire corporation. But who was he really? Before that night, Caleb Hayes had spent 9 years learning what it meant to be honorable. The suit he wore in the rain was the same one he had worn the day his name first reached the financial press. He had been a risk analyst then, and a careful one for almost a year before the collapse. He had filed warnings about his firm's exposure, signed memos, drawn up models that showed the cliff the board was driving toward. When the collapse came, those warnings disappeared from the record. What stayed behind was his signature on 3 internal documents, carefully selected by people above him, and a story the board could sell to investigators. By the time he understood what had happened, the press releases were already out. The man who had tried to stop the disaster became the public face of it. After that, no firm would touch him. He moved through years of temporary work, warehouse logging contract, bookkeeping late shifts in small offices that did not check references too closely. He kept his head down, saved what he could, and read the financial papers every morning out of a habit he could not break. The papers were his only routine outside the temporary work. He read them at the same kitchen table every morning with the same chipped mug before sunrise, the way another man might pray. He did not look for his own name. He had given up on that years ago. He read the business pages, the deal, announcements, the quarterly earnings reports, every page that had once been his profession and was now the country he had been deported from. The discipline of reading kept his eye trained, and the trained eye was the one thing nobody had been able to take from him. Carter and Vale Holdings was on the front of one of those papers the week before the rain. A glass tower in Midtown, a portfolio measured in billions, and a chief executive who had become a magazine cover at 34. Evelyn Carter did not smile in any of those photographs. She did not need to. The headline beneath her name read, "The youngest hand on the wheel of American real estate." And the article described her in 3 sentences Caleb read twice. She did not tolerate sentiment. She did not promote on merit alone. She believed the writer noted that a company had only 2 kinds of people inside it, those who created value and those who became cost. The piece quoted her once near the end. "I do not hire from compassion," she had said. "I hire from outcome." Caleb folded the paper and put it away. He could not have explained why the name Carter and Vale stayed with him for the rest of the week. He only knew when the next round of rejection letters arrived in his mailbox that he was going to walk into the lobby of that tower himself. The rain on the night he arrived was the kind that did not announce itself. It came down steady and quiet, the way late autumn rain in the city always did, until the seams of his shoes were soaked through and the cuffs of his jacket were heavy. He had taken the train from across the river and walked the last 6 blocks to save the fare. By the time he stepped through the revolving doors of Carter and Vale Holdings, he was leaving wet prints across the marble floor. The lobby was almost empty at that hour. 2 security men behind the front desk, a receptionist in a charcoal blazer, who looked up once and looked back down at her screen, the brass nameplate on the counter clean enough to seem printed yesterday. Caleb walked to the desk, set his folder of rejection letters and his single page of references on the counter, and asked to see the chief executive. The receptionist did not laugh. She did something worse. She typed a short message into her system, then told him without looking up that Miss Carter did not see applicants without an appointment. She was about to repeat the sentence when the elevator behind her opened, and Evelyn Carter herself stepped out with 2 senior managers at her shoulders. She was holding a phone in one hand and a closed leather portfolio in the other, mid-sentence about a project in Houston. Her coat was already on. Her glance swept the lobby out of habit and stopped on the wet figure at the front desk. She did not finish her sentence on the phone. She ended the call. "You really think a man like you belongs in this building?" She said it loud enough for the security men to hear, loud enough for the two managers behind her to share a small, private smile. A few employees lingering by the elevator turned their heads. Someone laughed openly. Caleb did not move. The folder under his arm was bent at one corner from the rain, and the references inside were 5 years old. He had memorized every word of them on the train ride over, because there was nothing else to do. He did not raise his voice when he answered. He simply looked at her, the way a man looks at a door he has already decided to walk through. "Give me 30 days, he said. "If I create no value for this company, I will disappear on my own." Whatever Evelyn Carter had expected to hear, it had not been that. She studied him for a long moment, the phone still in her hand. The two managers behind her stopped smiling. They had worked under her long enough to know the difference between her ordinary impatience and the silence she fell into when something caught her attention. She stepped past the desk and looked at the bent folder under his arm without opening it. She read his shoes instead, his sleeve, the line of his jaw. When she looked back at his eyes, her mouth tightened in something that was almost annoyance and almost interest. 30 days, she said. Records, basement archive. No badge above the 3rd floor. No conversation with anyone above a junior manager. You file what they hand you. You speak when you are asked. She turned to the senior manager on her left. "Tom, walk him through HR before you leave tonight. I want him in the basement at 7 in the morning." Tom started to object. She lifted one finger without looking at him, and the objection did not arrive. She was already turning back toward the revolving doors, the phone rising to her ear, the Houston conversation resuming, as if the last 90 seconds had not occurred. Caleb watched her go. He did not thank her. He did not smile. He picked his bent folder up from the counter, signed the visitor log under the receptionist's flat stare, and stood in the lobby, while his shoes finished bleeding water onto the marble. He had 30 days, and he had nothing to lose that had not already been taken from him 9 years earlier. The basement of Carter and Vale Holdings smelled of dust and dry air conditioning. It was 3 floors below street level, lit by long banks of overhead fluorescents, and the racks of physical files stretched from one painted wall to the other. The digital archive lived on a row of older terminals at the back, behind a glass partition no one ever locked. The first morning, a clerk named Howard handed Caleb a stack of property contracts from a closed project in Tampa and told him to log the metadata into the index. Howard did not introduce himself by full name. He did not look up from his desk after he handed over the stack. For the first 3 days, Caleb did exactly what was asked. He logged. He scanned. He did not raise his eyes from the terminal in front of him. He knew he was being watched. A camera in the back corner moved each time he crossed the room, and Howard reported to someone on the 9th floor twice a day. The badge on his lanyard read, "Contractor" in red letters, and no one in the building spoke to him beyond the words required to keep him moving. But the files he was logging were not nothing. By the 4th day, he had begun to notice the shape of what he was being given. The Tampa project had been closed for 2 years. The contracts archived the numbers final. He logged them one by one. The 3rd contract did not match the appraisal attached to it. The 5th contract referenced a sub-account that did not appear in the master ledger summary. The 7th contract was missing 2 pages between its valuation report and its closing memo, and the page numbers in the corner had been re-stamped to hide the gap. A junior clerk would have flagged it to a supervisor. Caleb did not. He kept logging. He copied nothing. He printed nothing. He only watched, and when his shift ended at 6, he stood up from the terminal and walked out through the loading dock, and he did not look back at the camera in the corner. By the 7th day, he had counted 19 separate inconsistencies across 3 closed projects. Most of them were small. A few of them were not. He recognized the pattern. He had built models against patterns exactly like it in another life, before his name went into the press. The structure was old. The technique was older. Whoever had assembled these books had been doing it for a long time, and they had been doing it under more than one chief executive. On the 8th day, he walked past the small bulletin board near the freight elevator on his way out. The board carried the company's quarterly investor letter, pinned at the corners. He had passed it every evening without reading it. That night, he stopped. He read the names of the board of directors listed at the bottom of the second page. He read them slowly because he had been trained a long time ago to read names slowly. The fourth name on the list was Gregory Mallory. Caleb stood under the fluorescence for almost a full minute without moving. He did not feel anger. First, anger came later when he was alone on the train. What he felt in the basement in front of the bulletin board was a quiet certainty he had not allowed himself in 9 years. Gregory Mallory had been the senior partner who signed off on the version of the story that buried his career. Mallory was the man who had selected the 3 memos with Caleb's signature and handed them to the press team. He had walked away from the original firm before the investigators could subpoena him, and the trail had gone cold within a year. He was now a sitting member of the Carter and Vale Board of Directors. Caleb folded the corner of the printout into a careful crease and left the basement. He had 2 choices. He could finish his 30 days and walk away with nothing quietly, the way he had walked out of every other building over the last 9 years. Or he could stay and finish what someone had buried, knowing that the same hands that had buried him were inside this building now. By the time the train crossed the river that night, he had already decided. The morning after he found Mallory's name on the board roster, Caleb arrived in the basement at 6:45 minutes before he was required. He logged the rest of the Tampa project without comment, then asked Howard for the next box. Howard handed it to him without looking up. The new box contained closed contracts from a residential development in Phoenix 3 years old, the kind of cold file no one expected anyone to read carefully again. He read carefully. By the second week, a routine had set itself around him without his asking for it. The contractor badge stayed at red. The senior staff still walked past him in the corridor as if he were part of the cabinet. A woman from facilities on her smoke break asked Howard once whether the basement was now hiring from shelters. Howard had laughed. Caleb had heard them both through the door he had not closed properly, and he kept his hand steady on the keyboard. On a Tuesday afternoon that week, he stepped into the freight elevator at the same moment Gregory Mallory was stepping out of it, 2 floors above ground. Mallory's eyes passed over the red badge once registered nothing and moved to the elevator panel. Caleb pressed the button for the basement. The doors closed between them with the small, mechanical certainty of a building that had decided which men were worth recognizing. What none of them saw was the second screen open on his terminal. He had no admin rights and no permission to query the live ledger system, but the archive feed read into the same indexing software as the basement files, and the same software had a search function nobody on the 9th floor had bothered to restrict. He had spent his first 8 days learning where the seams were. By the start of the second week, he was reading through those seams as cleanly as a finished report. The small problems started to disappear. A pending Lynn notice on a closed Sarasota property, which should have been released a year earlier, suddenly showed correct paperwork in the index. A pair of duplicated tenant entries in an old Brooklyn portfolio quietly merged into one. A misrouted payment trail from a sub-account no one had touched in 14 months found its way back to the master ledger, where it was supposed to have been all along. Each fix was small. None of them required a name on it. Caleb left no note, logged nothing in his own file, and corrected what was wrong, the way a man picks a piece of trash off a sidewalk on the way to work. The fixes did not go unnoticed for long. 2 weeks and a junior auditor on the 7th floor flagged a question in an internal email about why 3 legacy properties had stopped throwing flags in the compliance system. The email circulated for 2 days and arrived eventually on the desk of the chief executive. Evelyn Carter read it twice and did not respond to it. That afternoon, she came down to the basement herself, alone without her assistant, without an explanation. Howard scrambled to his feet when he saw her. She did not look at him. She walked the length of the racks until she reached the terminal Caleb was using and stood behind him for almost half a minute before she spoke. "You are logging contracts from the Phoenix file," she said. It was not a question. Caleb confirmed it without turning around. She placed a single sheet of paper on the corner of his desk, a copy of the auditor's email with 3 lines highlighted. "Did you correct these?" He looked at the paper, then at the screen, and told her he had. "You were not asked to," she said. He said no. "You touched live records from this terminal." He told her he had touched the index, not the live ledger, and that the corrections happened automatically once the index reconciled. Her eyes moved across him, the way a careful reader moves across a page. He had seen that look in the magazine photographs and underestimated it. In person, it was sharper. She picked the paper back up, folded it once, and put it inside her coat. "You will continue to log what Howard hands you," she said. "You will continue to correct what you find. You will not speak about it to anyone in this building, including him. The next time you find something you do not believe should be in those files, you will send it directly to my office, by hand, not through email. Are we clear?" He told her they were. She turned and walked back the way she had come without saying his name, and without thanking him, and Howard watched her leave with an expression that suggested he no longer knew which century he was working in. That was the first test. There were others. She began sending things down to him through a courier-sealed envelopes with closed project numbers, single questions clipped to old printouts, draft analyses from 2 of her senior managers, with handwritten notes in the margins that said, "Look at this and tell me what you see." He answered every one of them in writing by hand, in clean, short sentences, and sent the answers back through the same courier. He never met her in the elevator. He never went above the 3rd floor. The contractor badge stayed red. By the 3rd week, the small problems had stopped surfacing in compliance because the small problems had stopped existing. The senior managers Evelyn had been quietly asking him to second-guess began to lose arguments at the executive meetings and could not explain why. Some of them blamed her tone. Some of them blamed the new auditor she had not actually hired. None of them looked at the basement, which was exactly the way she had arranged it. On the 18th day of his 30, the courier brought down a thick black binder. The label across its spine read, "Project Westland Final Financial Review." Caleb had heard the name twice in the corridor. Westland was a $1.2 billion mixed-use development on the west side of Phoenix, the largest piece of new construction in Carter and Vale's pipeline that year. The financial model inside the binder had been signed off by Daniel Reeves, the chief financial officer, and by 2 senior analysts under him. Evelyn's note clipped to the front cover was 4 words long. "Tell me what's wrong." He read the binder twice. By the end of the 2nd reading, he had a sheet of yellow legal paper covered in his own handwriting, and a feeling in his chest he had not allowed himself in years. The model was not wrong by accident. The financing assumptions had been adjusted by 0.5 percentage point in the 2nd-year refinancing window, and the construction cost inflation curve had been pulled down by an amount that was technically defensible and quietly disastrous. Either change by itself would have raised an eyebrow. Together, they made a project that was already thin-look comfortable, and made a project that should have been killed look fundable. The numbers had not been faked. They had been bent toward a destination. He drafted a 4-page response. He used no jargon Evelyn would have to look up, and he wrote his conclusions in the first paragraph instead of the last. The project, as currently structured, would absorb capital for 2 years, and then break the company's debt covenants in the 3rd. He attached 3 corrected scenarios. He named no one. He sent the binder back up at the end of the day. Upstairs, Evelyn called Daniel Reeves into her office that afternoon and put the 4 pages in front of him. He read the first paragraph and went pale around the mouth. He had not made the inflation adjustment he told her. He had been informed the inflation adjustment had cleared an external review in late summer. When she asked him who had told him that, he hesitated, and the hesitation was longer than the answer that followed. He said it had come down to him through legal, with a routing memo from a subcommittee of the board. She asked him whether he could produce the routing memo. He told her he could try. He left her office without saying anything else, and his footfalls down the corridor were not as steady as they had been on the way in. She did not call him back. She sat at her desk for 10 minutes without moving, and then she opened the personnel file of the contractor in the basement and looked at the blank box where his work history should have been. The address listed was an apartment 2 blocks from a train station in Newark. The references listed were 5 years old. The signature on the bottom of the contractor form was steady and small, and had been made with a pen pressed hard enough that the impression went through to the back of the page. She closed the file. That night, she came down to the basement after the rest of the floor had gone home. The fluorescents hummed in the empty racks. She was carrying his 4 pages and the binder both. "Sit," she said. He sat. She did not. "You see what they did," she said. He told her he did. She asked whether Daniel Reeves had done it himself. He told her he could not tell from this. 2 of the adjustments were inside Reeves's authority, but 1 was not. Someone above Reeves had signed it through before it reached her desk. She asked him how he knew. He told her the version date on the inflation curve was older than the version date on the cover memo, that the model had been edited after Reeves finalized it, that Reeves had not initialed the change, and that the name field in the audit trail was blank. She was quiet for a long moment. The corner of her mouth was not moving in the way it had not moved in the lobby on the night of the rain. It was a different kind of stillness. On the 29th day, she said, "I want you in the boardroom on the 34th floor at 9 in the morning. You will present these findings to the full board. You will dress in something that does not embarrass me. Do you understand?" He told her he did. She turned to go and then turned back at the door. "Mr. Hayes." It was the first time she had used his name. He answered. "Who are you really?" she said. He did not answer. She studied him for the second time in 3 weeks, the way a person studies a chessboard on which the opponent has just moved a piece that was not supposed to be on the table. Then she nodded once, a movement that committed to nothing, and walked out. The basement fell back to the hum of the fluorescents and the soft turning of the camera in the corner. The next morning he opened a new search. He told the indexing software to find every file in the Carter and Vale archive system that referenced a closed real estate trust called Briar Point Holdings. He had not said the name out loud in 9 years. Briar Point Holdings had been the shell vehicle his old firm had used to absorb 3 of its toxic positions in the months before the collapse, the same 3 positions his memos had warned about. The shell had been publicly wound down the year after the scandal, and the trail had ended in a holding subsidiary none of the investigators had been able to track. The indexing software returned 46 results. He read them through that morning and through his unpaid lunch break, and through the hour after the rest of the basement had clocked out at 6. By the time he turned the terminal off, he understood what he had walked into. Briar Point Holdings had not been wound down. It had been absorbed in pieces through 3 intermediate entities into a Carter and Vale subsidiary, still listed on the company's books. 2 of the original Briar Point signatories had crossed over with it. One of them had retired. The other was Gregory Mallory, the earliest signature transferring Briar Point's residual assets into the Carter and Vale subsidiary, dated 9 years ago and stamped with the founder's own initials, was Richard Carter Evelyn's father. Caleb sat in the basement long enough for the lights to dim into their night mode and brighten again when the camera in the corner registered him through the motion sensor. The man who had buried his career hadn't done it alone. He had done it under the roof he was now standing in. He had 10 days left in his 30. He could close the search, now file his clean Westland presentation walk into the boardroom on the 29th day, save the company from a bad project, and leave with what he had come for: a clean name, a reference away back into the industry that had pushed him out. Or he could put the Briarpoint file on the second half of the same presentation in front of the same board that had signed his career away 9 years ago, and let the room watch what happened next. He printed nothing. He copied nothing. He memorized the names. Then he went home, and over the next 4 nights, he wrote 2 presentations on the same laptop. One was clean. One was not. He did not know until the night before, the 29th day, which one he was going to use. 2 floors above the basement, in a corner office with a view of the river he never looked at, Gregory Mallory was reading a quarterly compliance summary that did not mention his name. The line at the bottom of the 3rd page told him 3 legacy issues he had been tracking for months had quietly resolved themselves. He read the line twice. He did not call compliance. He did not call the chief executive. He called the head of internal security and asked in a voice that did not raise itself, who had been hired into the basement in the last 60 days. The head of internal security told him there was a single contractor on a temporary 30-day arrangement, working without elevated access. Mallory asked for the contractor's name. The head of internal security said he would get back to him. Over the next 4 nights, Mallory made 2 phone calls an evening to a board colleague who had been on the original subcommittee with him 9 years before. The first night the colleague laughed and told him to stop seeing ghosts. The second night, the colleague stopped laughing. By the 3rd night, neither of them was sleeping, and the colleague had begun talking about whether certain documents would survive what he called a routine pull. They both knew what a routine pull was. They both knew what would not survive one. On the 4th night, the colleague suggested they speak in person, somewhere that was not the building. Mallory agreed. They met in a hotel lobby that did not keep its cameras pointed at the bar, and they walked out 2 hours later, having decided nothing. They had not already decided alone. The head of internal security did not get back to Mallory until the afternoon of the 27th day, and by then, the man's name was the smallest of his problems. Up on the 34th floor, on the night of the 27th day, in an office she had still never invited, Caleb into Evelyn Carter sat with her father's old framed photograph on the credenza behind her desk and read the 4-page memo about Project Westland for the 5th time. She had built her presidency on a single belief that the company she had inherited was clean enough to defend. She had spent 10 years burying the questions that contradicted that belief, retiring the executives who asked them, and writing the company's annual letter herself so that the language stayed exactly the way she wanted it. The memo on her desk had not contradicted that belief. The man who had written it, she suspected, was about to. She did not call security. She did not call her father, who had been retired for 6 years and lived in a coastal house in Carmel he no longer left unless a doctor required it. He had taught her to read a balance sheet at 12. He had walked her through her first quarterly report at 16. He had told her more than once that the company they had built together was the cleanest house in the industry. She had believed him because she had wanted to, and because every story she had told herself about her own career had begun in a chair he had pulled out for her in his old office. She poured a glass of water she did not drink. She pulled up the contractor file on her tablet and read it for the 2nd time that month. The file contained a single line for employment history. It listed an accounting office in Newark. It did not list anything from before. She set the tablet down and stared at the city lights through the window for a long time without moving. On the morning of the 28th day, she came down to the basement one last time. She did not bring a courier. She did not bring an envelope. She brought a copy of the Westland presentation Caleb had finalized the night before the clean one, the one he had sent up through the proper channel that morning. She set it on his desk and asked him quietly whether everything he intended to present tomorrow was inside it. He told her it was. He did not look up when he said it, because he had not finished writing the 2nd file yet, and he did not know which of the 2 presentations he was going to load onto the flash drive until the lights in his apartment had gone off and on twice that night. She studied him for a long time. She did not ask the question again. When she left, the fluorescents hummed back into their ordinary silence, and Caleb opened the second presentation on his laptop, the one she had not seen, and read through it for the last time. The night before, the 29th day, he put both files on a single flash drive, slipped it into his jacket pocket, and turned the lights off. The 34th floor was already half full when Caleb stepped out of the elevator at 5 minutes to 9 on the 29th day. The boardroom doors were open. A circular table of dark wood, 12 chairs, a screen at the far wall, and a folder of printed presentations at every seat. He recognized 2 of the faces from the financial press. He recognized one of the others, Gregory Mallory, sitting in the 3rd chair from the left, reading something on his phone with the patience of a man who had heard a name the day before and had not slept much since. Evelyn was already at the head of the table, dressed in the same charcoal she had worn in the lobby the night of the rain. She did not look up when he entered. Margaret Holloway, the independent chair, stood to introduce him, read his name and his function from a single-line card, and asked the room to give him their attention. He plugged the flash drive into the laptop on the side table. He did not greet anyone. He clicked through to the first slide of the clean presentation. The one Evelyn had reviewed, the one Margaret Holloway expected. For the next 35 minutes, he walked the room through Project Westland. He did it the same way he had drafted the 4-page memo conclusions. First evidence, second no jargon a board member would have to look up. He showed them the inflation curve adjustment. He showed them the version date that predated the cover memo. He showed them the empty audit trail name field. He showed them on a single slide the 3 corrected scenarios and the year in which the unmodified model would have broken the company's debt covenants. He named no one. When he finished the Westland section, half the table was leaning forward. Daniel Reeves, sitting across from Mallory, had not moved in 15 minutes. Margaret Holloway thanked him and was about to call for questions. Caleb told her there was one more file. He clicked to the next slide. The screen changed to a single document scan dated 9 years ago and a title in plain font, Briar Point Holdings, Residual Asset Transfer Signatories. The room did not realize what it was looking at for a full 5 seconds. Mallory realized first. The phone he had been holding moved down to his lap with a slowness that was almost casual, and his free hand reached without thinking for the empty glass in front of him. Caleb did not raise his voice. He told the room what Briar Point Holdings had been. He told them where its assets had gone. He told them the names of the 2 signatories who had crossed over with it into a Carter and Vale subsidiary, still on the company's books. He showed them the date. He showed them the initials at the bottom of the page. The first set of initials belonged to Gregory Mallory. The second set belonged to Richard Carter. "My name is Caleb Hayes," he said. 9 years ago, I was the risk analyst at the firm that originated the positions you see on the screen. I filed 13 separate warnings about those positions before that firm collapsed. The warnings disappeared from the record. 3 internal memos with my signature did not. The senior partner who selected those 3 memos and gave them to the press team is sitting 4 seats to my left. The room was no longer leaning forward. It had stopped moving at all. I came to this building 30 days ago because I had nowhere else to go. I stayed because I found the same hands inside it that had buried me. Project Westland is real, and the recommendation in your folder is correct. Briar Point Holdings is also real, and the second recommendation is the one I am bringing to this board now. I am asking for an independent audit of the Carter and Vale subsidiary that absorbed those assets, and I am asking for it to begin today, before any signatory in this room has the opportunity to revise a file. What? He turned the laptop off. The Briar Point slide stayed on the wall screen behind him because he had not closed the projector. Margaret Holloway was the first person to speak, and the sentence she chose was the only one a chair could survive in that moment. She asked him whether he would be willing to repeat his last request on the record, with counsel present. He told her he would. The crisis did not begin in the boardroom. It began in the hallway outside it 20 minutes later, when the meeting had been recessed, and Mallory tried to walk to the elevator without speaking, and was stopped by a junior member of the board who had been quiet for the entire hour. The junior member did not raise his voice either. He simply asked Mallory whether the second set of initials on the document had been signed by Richard Carter personally, or by an executive officer holding power of attorney. Mallory told him to move. The junior member did not move. By the time security arrived to escort Mallory back into the conference room until counsel could be located, 3 other board members had already begun typing on their phones, and the law firm that handled Carter and Vale's external compliance was on its way upstairs. Below the 34th floor, the building noticed before it knew anything. A pair of receptionists on the 20th floor saw 3 lawyers in dark suits step out of the elevator together. A senior analyst on the 11th floor heard the words, "internal audit," from a colleague who was not supposed to know them yet. By the end of the day, the line at the coffee station in the lobby was longer than it had been on any morning in the previous quarter. And the line was not for coffee. Nobody said it out loud, but every person in the building who had ever signed a document they were uncertain about found a reason to walk past the security desk that afternoon to see who was being escorted in and out. Evelyn watched it all from the head of the table. She had not stood up. She had not turned to look at the screen behind her. The Briarpoint slide had stayed up for almost a full minute after Caleb closed his laptop, and she had read every line on it without moving. The signature at the bottom belonged to her father. She had seen that signature on Christmas cards, and on the cover of his book, and on the inside flap of the watch she still wore. She did not need to compare it. She knew it. When the room emptied, she sat in her chair for 10 minutes without moving. Then she stood, walked the length of the table, and pulled the document up on her own tablet. The signature was where Caleb had shown it. The date was where Caleb had shown it. There was no clerical error on which she could hang the next 20 years of her presidency. She did not call her father that day. She did not call him the next day either. She called Margaret Holloway, and she called outside counsel, and she signed the engagement letter for the independent audit before the close of business on the 29th day. The auditor was a firm she had used twice before, in matters small enough that she could afford to be honest. This was not small. The audit took 11 weeks. In the first week, Daniel Reeves produced the routing memo Evelyn had asked him for, the one that had cleared the Westland inflation adjustment without his initials. The routing memo led to a subcommittee of 2. One member of the subcommittee was Gregory Mallory. The other had retired 3 years before, but kept a consulting contract with a Mallory-linked entity, which paid him a quarterly retainer, the size of a junior partner's salary. The retainer payments traced back through 2 intermediaries to the same Carter and Vale subsidiary that had absorbed Briarpoint Holdings. In the 3rd week, the auditors found the original Briarpoint warnings, the same memos Caleb had filed before the collapse, before the rain, before the 9 years of unhearable that had followed. The memos had not been destroyed. They had been refiled under a different cover page in an internal archive nobody used. The cover page was dated 3 months after his name went into the press. In the 7th week, the first board resignation arrived. Mallory's. He did not write a letter. He had his counsel deliver a single page that referenced personal health, and a desire to spend more time with private interests was not contested. The second resignation came 9 days later. The third from the chair of the audit committee came the morning the auditors filed their preliminary report. Evelyn read the preliminary report in her office on a Tuesday night, alone, with the same glass of water she had poured on the night of the 29th day. The report did not mention her by name. It mentioned her father in 6 places. It mentioned the subsidiary in 11. She read it through twice, set it down, and called Caleb's number for the first time on a phone he had not given her. He answered on the 3rd ring. She did not say hello. "I have read it," she said. He did not say hello either. He told her he understood. "I am calling outside counsel in the morning to begin restructuring the board," she said. "I would like to ask you to take a position, not the one you came here for, the one I should have offered you on the night of the rain." He did not answer immediately. When he did, he told her he would consider it on one condition, She asked what the condition was. He told her that the position would have to come with a written acknowledgement from the company of his original warnings, not a press release, not a settlement, but a single line in the next annual letter on the page she wrote herself. She told him the line would be there. The Carter and Vale annual letter, when it went out 4 months later, contained a sentence in the second paragraph of the second page. It read, "We have re-examined certain decisions made by our predecessor leadership 9 years ago, and we have corrected the record where the record was wrong, including the unjust attribution of those decisions to an analyst who attempted at the time to prevent them. We regret the cost of that error. We are grateful that the analyst has chosen to continue his career inside this company." The sentence did not name him. It did not have to. The letter went out at 6 in the morning Eastern Time. By 8:03, former colleagues from the old firm had sent Caleb messages he had not received in nearly a decade. 2 were apologies. 1 was a job offer at a firm where the writer was now a partner. He read all 3 without answering them. He had not come back for apologies, and he had not come back for offers. By the time the letter went out, Caleb Hayes had been the director of risk management of Carter and Vale Holdings for 98 days. His office was on the 17th floor, halfway between the basement, where he had logged the Tampa contracts, and the boardroom, where he had opened the Briar Point slide. The badge on his lanyard read, "Director in Black." He had not asked for a higher floor. He had asked for the 17th specifically, because it was the lowest floor with a window. On the night the annual letter went out, Evelyn stopped by his office on her way home. She did not knock. She set a single printed copy of the letter on his desk, tapped the second paragraph of the second page once, and stood by his window for a moment, looking at the river. She did not turn around when she finally asked the question. "After everything this company did to you," she said, "why did you still save it?" Caleb closed the file he had been reading. He looked at her, back at the city lights, past her shoulder, at the line of the river that ran through all those years like a margin. "Because a wrong system should not be fixed through destruction," he said. "It should be fixed through truth." She did not answer. She stood at the window for another minute, then nodded once the same small movement she had given him in the basement the night she had asked him who he was, and he had not answered. Then she walked out without turning around. Outside the glass, the city kept its ordinary lights on. Cabs at the intersection, a delivery truck idling at the curb, the same buildings he had walked past on the train ride over 9 years and 30 days and 98 days ago. Nothing in the skyline had moved, but inside that building for the first time in many years, the people who held the most power had been forced to look directly at the consequences of themselves. The boardroom on the 34th floor was being rebuilt with different chairs. The subsidiary that had absorbed Briar Point Holdings was being wound down properly this time, under the supervision of an auditor who answered to no one in the room. And on the 17th floor, in an office halfway between a basement and a window, a man who had been told for 9 years that he no longer belonged in his own profession was reading the next set of files quietly the way he had always read them, the way he was going to keep reading them. He had not come back for the office. He had come back for the record.